Note to listeners, this story was originally written in Finnish. As with many translations, certain jokes and wordplays may not work as intended after translation. Efforts have been made to adapt the humor to maintain the story's tone and spirit. Additionally, character names and measurement units have been adjusted to ensure the story is as easy to listen as possible. Falling Down North, written by H. Ruda. Prologue, somewhere in northern Finland. Sunday, 8:45 p.m. The gravel crunched under the tires as the old silver-gray Mercedes executed a three-point turn in the yard. The bright yellow taxi sign on the car's roof stood out in the gray-green landscape like a black man at a Ku Klux Klan fundraiser. The man who had arrived by taxi watched the car recede into the distance. He regretted not asking the driver to wait for 5 minutes before leaving. The meeting might be short. Their last encounter had ended on tense terms. The traveler had hit the road out of necessity without a clear plan and hoped that the owner of the cabin would offer him refuge for at least a couple of days. The man lit a cigarette. The smell of the Mercedes exhaust still lingered in the air. A bird was calling out a short, monotonous melody from somewhere within the spruces surrounding the yard. A green 90s-era Citroen was parked in front of the gray log cabin. On the right side of the yard was a shed, which had once been red a long time ago. Now, only faded patches of color remained. At the end of the shed was a wire enclosure with about half a dozen chickens scratching the dirt. No shortage of eggs, the man chuckled. There was a picture of a dog on the cabin wall. Below the picture, a sign read, "You set the direction, I'll set the pace." The dog in the picture lay beside the cabin's steps, but it wasn't much interested in guarding anything. It just glared from beneath its brows. The visitor looked down at his feet. His left shoe was a size too small and painfully pinched his toes. His right ankle ached from a recent sprain. Soon, he could take the shoes off, the man thought hopefully. In his left hand, he carried a green gym bag. It contained, among other things, highly unsuitable spare clothes, an empty vodka bottle, and some cash. The bag felt heavy, and his back ached. The uneven, long taxi ride and the well-worn back seat of the Mercedes hadn't done any favors for his impending back pain, and every large bump had left him breathless, likely due to a couple of broken ribs. The man wiped his temple. Blood trickled from the corner of his left eye where he had accidentally scratched open a scab. His groin still throbbed occasionally with pain. The last few days had perhaps been overly rough and action-packed, but now he felt a bit of relief. The door of the gray log cabin creaked open, and a middle-aged, pot-bellied, and otherwise utterly average man appeared in the doorway. The visitor, however, knew that what set this man apart from the crowd were his particularly lewd jokes. The host nodded in greeting. The visitor at the end of the driveway nodded back and started walking toward the door. He flicked his half-smoked cigarette into an old 2.5-gallon paint bucket serving as an ashtray. It was half full or half empty, depending on one's perspective. It would have been full if it had also contained the butts that had missed. The cabin resident disappeared into the shadows. The gray wooden steps creaked with every step and seemed ready to give way at any moment. Despite the complaining sounds, they held the man's weight, and the visitor stepped inside through the open door. He removed his shoes and wiggled his toes in relief now that the pinching shoe lay on the entryway floor. His feet had sweated all day in the shoes, and his socks felt damp. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of coffee and tobacco. The cabin was sparsely furnished, indicating that the host was its sole occupant. There were no paintings or decorations on the gray log walls, unless one counted the solitary moose skull with its massive antlers, bolted to the wall above a 26-inch CRT television. The floor was covered with a large, colorful rag rug. Most of its vibrant colors were obscured by dirt tracked in on shoes and socks. The visitor followed the host into the cabin's kitchen. A clock on the wall ticked, and from an old radio on the windowsill came the weather forecast. On the long kitchen table were an ashtray and a half-drunk bottle of Kosken Korva, its cap discarded directly into the trash after opening. There were also 2 brown coffee cups and a copper pot from which steam was rising from its curved spout. Instead of chairs, there were benches running along both sides of the table. The visitor followed the host's example and sat down. He tried to read the man's face for signs of hostility, but it looked more like the host was struggling to suppress a smile. The men sat on opposite sides of the table without saying a word. Coffee was poured into the cups, leaving room not for cream, but for vodka. Next, a generous splash of Koskenkorva was added to each cup. "Finish coffee," the host said, swirling his dirty index finger in each cup to help the alcohol mix with the coffee. The visitor looked up questioningly. He meant to say he was trying to cut down on drinking, but changed his mind. The host shook the hot liquid off his finger and handed a cup to his guest. The cups clinked together, and the visitor took a cautious sip of the steaming hot drink. It tasted purely of coffee and vodka, but he couldn't shake the thought of the dirty finger that had stirred it. The host placed his cup on the table and curiously examined his guest's battered face. The visitor remained silent despite the scrutiny. After a long silence, the host finally spoke. "So tell me what happened to you?" The visitor took a sip and wiped a drop from the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand. "Well, I can tell you, but first, do you have a DVD player?" Chapter 1, Wednesday, 11:47 p.m. The man sat in an armchair that had seen better days. It had cost about as much as a mid-range sofa when new. The leather was cracked, and the chair had a footrest that lifted up from the front. The dim room was lit only by the glow of a 32-inch flat-screen TV. In the old days, or as some would say, the good old days, the screen would have shown static, but now the blue background bore the words, "No signal." On the TV stand next to the television sat an old Pioneer stereo system. Below the record player were an amplifier, a radio, and a double cassette deck. On either side of the stereo were wooden-cased speakers connected to the system. There wasn't much else in the room. Shouting came from the neighboring apartment. A woman was nagging at a man. Who knew what about this time? There seemed to be a reason for their arguments every night. The woman must have been on a permanent period, or maybe the frequency of her nagging meant it should be called a daily occurrence. Or perhaps the guy really was a complete jerk. Maybe it was time to print out some divorce papers and drop them through their mail slot. Would they get the message? Jeff Reynolds lounged in his chair with an empty beer bottle in hand. He was named after his grandfather, who in his later years proved to be a strong candidate for the title of Alcoholic of the Decade. As they say, nomen est omen, the name is a sign. Drinking had been a hobby of Reynolds's since he was a kid. This probably hadn't been on his parents' minds when they named him. At 12 years old, he'd gotten drunk for the first time. After that, there was no going back to a time before drinking. Within a couple of years, drinking had become a weekly habit, a ritual that broke up the monotony of everyday life. Gradually, it expanded from Friday to Saturday and Sunday. Eventually, it became a nightly activity. He didn't always need drinking buddies. Beer tasted good alone, too. That's what Reynolds was doing now, drinking alone. In fact, he rarely drank with others anymore. Jeffrey had come to the conclusion that most people were complete assholes, and the remaining 30% who weren't assholes were total idiots. Of course, there were a few exceptions to this rule. Jeffrey stared blankly ahead, not seeing anything. He hadn't blinked in a couple of minutes. His already bloodshot eyes felt like they were drying out in his head. A cigarette rested on the armrest of the chair, its burning end reaching his middle and index fingers. When the nerve signal finally traveled along its decayed pathways to his brain, Jeffrey reflexively shook his hand. The cigarette butt flew onto the rug between him and the TV. Reynolds cursed. He quickly grabbed the butt from the rug and extinguished it in the glass ashtray on the table. The burning end had left a dark mark on the rug. Jeffrey leaned back in his chair. He rubbed his eyes and then his stubbled cheek. He hadn't shaved, but what did it matter? He listened to the nagging from the other side of the wall for a moment. Why the hell were they still together? Reynolds adjusted the volume on his hearing aid to make it quieter. He had kicked his own wife out about 5 years ago. He had grown tired of the nagging and the constant, unfounded accusations. Usually, he'd hear about how he hadn't done something, and if he had done it, then he'd done it wrong. Jeffrey had first thrown his wife into the snow, but eventually, by official decree, he had to leave the house himself. If only he'd turned down the hearing aid then. It would have saved him from a lot of nagging and much more. The wife got the kids in the house. Jeffrey was left with child support payments. Maybe it was for the best. Reynolds pulled a new cigarette from the pack, placed it in his mouth, and struck a match. The warmth of the flame felt good on his face, and the freshly lit cigarette smelled nice as always. Life's small joys. Nowadays, they were so damn expensive that it might be cheaper to switch to harder drugs. Jeffrey woke up his phone's screen with the power button. It was almost midnight. He should go to bed. The alarm would go off in just over 4 hours. Reynolds took a deep drag and then exhaled the smoke slowly. Smoking was not allowed in the apartment, but what did it matter? He was already 2 months behind on rent, and soon he'd lose the place. Luckily, the law allowed tenants to contest eviction for at least half a year before losing the apartment. Too bad for the landlord. Nice guy. Didn't want to cause him trouble. Reynolds' transportation company was doing poorly, and child support took a large chunk of his meager income. After covering running costs, the remaining money went to cigarettes and booze. Some of it had to be spent on food, too. Luckily, macaroni and bread were cheap. For meat, he had to settle for products with low meat content. Reynolds grabbed the remote to turn off the TV, but his finger hit wrong key, and the screen showed Michael Douglas in a white short-sleeved shirt and thick-rimmed glasses. Jeffrey recognized the movie immediately. Falling down, he chuckled, half amused. Same here. In the movie, Douglas's character, William Foster, has a mental breakdown in a morning traffic jam. He abandons his car in the slow-moving line and faces one misfortune after another. The mentally unstable Foster tries to get to his ex-wife's house for his daughter's birthday. Things spiral out of control, and soon Foster is armed and on the run from the police. Reynolds docked the cigarette between his lips and leaned forward to free one of the pint-sized Budweiser cans from a six-pack. Normally, he'd have had some cheap beer, but he had taken the Budweiser pack from his truck's load. The local shopkeeper wouldn't notice a few missing six-packs, or at least hadn't hinted at it in the past 7 years Reynolds had been delivering beer and sausages to him. A few six-packs now and then, straight from the load. Job perks. Jeffrey popped open the can. Foam gushed from the opening. His index finger got a little wet, and Reynolds licked it dry. He leaned back against the backrest and continued watching the movie. That guy is nuts. Even when everything goes wrong, he just keeps pushing. Doesn't let anyone walk all over him. Beer started flowing at an increasing pace as he enjoyed the movie. About an hour later, the end credits rolled on the screen. It was a shame he'd missed the beginning. This time, his finger didn't stray, and the TV switched off, plunging the room into darkness. Reynolds had downed the entire six-pack in one sitting. He stood up from his armchair and wobbled a bit. "Whoops," Reynolds said with a crooked smile. Jeffrey headed towards the light streaming from the bathroom door. Bright urine streamed into the dirty toilet. Below the waterline, the bowl was shit brown, and the upper rim had ingrained dirt and loose pubic hairs shaped like question marks. Would it be cheaper to hire a cleaner than to get a wife to take care of the place? Reynolds wondered, noticing he was swaying a bit. A cleaner would at least be easier to get, if not cheaper. The flow of urine continued. Sometimes Jeffrey wondered, what if it never stopped? How long would he keep pissing before giving up? But as always, the flow finally slowed to a trickle. Jeffrey shook himself off and tucked his equipment back into his sweatpants. He carelessly rinsed his hands under the tap and then leaned against the sink. The man staring back at him from the mirror looked tired. Bloodshot eyes stared back steadily. For the first time in a long while, he saw something other than fatigue and hopelessness in them. The movie falling down had planted a seed of an idea in his mind. His twin daughters would have a birthday soon. They deserved something special. a proper gift. He needed to get a grip and do something radical, something that might be his last act as a free man. Tomorrow I'll start planning and preparing for it, Reynolds decided. Chapter 2, Thursday, 4:15 a.m. The white alarm clock on the floor blared to life. Reynolds didn't own a bedside table to place the clock on. He hadn't seen the need to get one. The blaring sound, akin to a screeching alarm, finally silenced after a few groggy swipes. Jeffrey squinted toward the clock. The red numbers indicated 4:15. The shock was turning into irritation once again. His heart was pounding too fast. The harsh sound of the alarm startled him every time, but Reynolds didn't trust his phone's alarm clock. The mistrust was justified, though Jeffrey didn't yet realize that. His mouth was dry. It felt like his cheeks were glued to his gums and teeth. Jeffrey tried to swallow. His Adam's apple seemed to return with a delay. The alcohol from the night before had dehydrated his body severely, and now his bladder was bursting again. Jeffrey swung his legs off the cold laminate floor and sat up on the edge of the bed. Sitting aggravated the pressure on his bladder, approaching painful levels. The urgency to pee also increased a notch. Jeffrey pushed himself up. The porcelain was calling. A moment later, Reynolds flicked on the bathroom light. The fluorescent light flickered a few times before settling into a blinding brightness. Jeffrey raised his hand to shield his bleary eyes and walked up to the toilet. His morning wood was too strong for standing up to pee, so Reynolds lowered the seat and sat down. He leaned forward, supporting himself on his knees. The seat felt cold against his backside. A soft splash echoed in the bowl as his bladder began to empty. Jeffrey stared through the open bathroom door into the hallway. He felt himself swaying slightly with the rhythm of his heartbeat. Then, the plan from the previous day came back to mind. His mild hangover eased a bit. After emptying his bladder, Jeffrey drank straight from the tap, swished, and spat into the sink. The dryness in his mouth subsided. He grimaced at the mirror, examined his teeth, and decided he didn't need to brush them yet. Toothpaste cost money, and he preferred to spend that money on beer. Reynolds filled his palms with water, wet his graying hair, and combed it back towards the nape of his neck. In the bedroom, he pulled on faded blue sweatpants and a thick red and black checkered flannel shirt over a white sleeveless undershirt. In the kitchen, he grabbed a half-full can of orange juice from the almost empty refrigerator. Jeffrey poured the liquid down his throat as his Adam's apple bobbed rhythmically. The taste was tart but refreshing. The empty can flew into the sink among the dirty dishes with a burp. The day's supplies were ready in a thin, transparent plastic bag intended for fruits. This time, there were no fruits in the bag, just 3 boiled eggs, his standard set. Jeffrey grabbed the bag, slammed the fridge door shut, and headed for the hallway. His dirty sneakers slipped on his feet, and the door slammed shut behind him. The hottest part of summer was already over, but the nights were still warm. Reynolds stood for a moment in the doorway, looking and listening to ensure there were no others around. He didn't want to run into neighbors. At this hour, it was unlikely, but better safe than sorry. The complex consisted of 2 row houses, each with 5 single-story apartments. Between the buildings were parking spaces and storage areas, with a fenced shelter for large trash bins at one end. The sand crunched under his sneakers as Reynolds walked toward the white 1987 Ford Sierra RS Cosworth, which was parked in the lot. The wheel arches were rusted, but otherwise it was in good condition for its age. Above the rear window was an oversized spoiler. He had bought the Sierra around the time Finland won its first ice hockey world championship in '95. There had been a couple more championships since then, but the car hadn't changed. Reynolds opened the driver's door, tossed the eggs onto the passenger seat, and took his place behind the wheel. The Sierra roared to life without issues, which likely woke up a few neighbors as the exhaust pipe was broken right after the manifold. Jeffrey stomped the gas a few times to make sure the neighbors got their share of his early wake-up call. The car roared and banged furiously. He reversed out of the spot and sped off towards the company's office. A few minutes later, he arrived. Reynolds's truck was parked in front of a red metal building on one of the many lots in the industrial area. Jeffrey backed the Sierra up beside the truck. He glanced at the analog clock on the car's center console. It was 5:15. Reynolds grabbed the eggs and got out of the car. The Sierra keys disappeared into the sweatpants pocket, and the truck keys emerged. The truck door creaked open. The eggs flew onto the passenger seat again. There were only a couple of deliveries to make for the early morning. Then he'd have time to focus on the plan. Jeffrey finished his work in record time and was ready by just after 8. After backing the truck into the same spot he had taken it from a few hours earlier, Reynolds jumped back into the Sierra. His stomach growled, and Jeffrey ripped open the egg bag from below the knot. He grabbed an egg, cracked the shell against the gear stick, and began peeling the calcium carbonate from the egg's surface. The shells flew out the open window. Reynolds dug out small paper salt packets from the glove compartment, which he had taken by the handful from a fast food place's condiment stand. 1 packet per egg. Far too much for blood pressure, but who cared? He'd worry about that after the job, Jeffrey thought. He had started referring to his plan as the job. First, he needed to figure out a few things online. He could access the internet with his phone, but it would be excruciatingly slow since, for cost reasons, he had switched to the slowest possible connection. It was roughly equivalent to a 90s dial-up modem. Besides, he didn't want to leave any traces for internet geeks to find. Was there a computer at the library? Jeffrey wondered. Probably, but he wasn't sure. I haven't been to the library in at least 20 years. No, it must be at least 30 years, Reynolds thought. He decided that the library would be a suitable place to start his research. Jeffrey stuffed the last egg into his mouth and wiped the eggshells that had fallen into his lap onto the car floor. He started the car. The exhaust roar resonated against the metal walls of the building behind him. Were there surveillance cameras at the library? Probably, and there would likely be records of computer searches, at least if movies and TV shows were anything to go by. He needed some sort of disguise, Reynolds thought. He decided to first stop by Budget Mart. Surely he'd find something suitable there. It was 8:30 when Jeffrey turned off the Sierra's engine in Budget Mart's almost empty parking lot. A short old lady glared disapprovingly at the loud Sierra. Reynolds looked away. He watched the passing traffic for a moment and then dared to glance back at the old lady. She stood rooted to the spot, staring at Jeffrey. Their eyes met, and for a few seconds, Reynolds could sense the primitive anger from the old lady. Finally, the hunched old woman turned away and continued on her way, pulling a wheeled suitcase behind her. Reynolds shivered. He waited until the old lady had completely disappeared before getting out of the car. Jeffrey hurried into Budget Mart as inconspicuously as possible. Perhaps it was unnecessary, as the Sierra's engine noise was so attention-grabbing that anyone interested had already noticed him. He planned to get the exhaust fixed if the job went according to plan. In the store, Reynolds examined the clothing section. The first thing he picked up was a blue cap. Jeffrey didn't recognize the logo on it. It might belong to some American basketball or baseball team, but he was more into boxing and snooker. Next, Reynolds went to the coat rack. It had a sign saying all coats were half off. They were individual items and clearance products. Reynolds browsed through the coats until he found a beige trench coat. It had large collars and a hem that reached mid-thigh. Just like the TV detective Columbo, Jeffrey thought and pulled the price tag from inside the collar. He was disappointed to see the price. The coat wouldn't be cheap even at half off, but it would be perfect for his purpose. Reynolds headed towards the checkout, but stopped once again when he reached the sunglasses stand. He examined the selection and eventually chose a pair of narrow, curved glasses. They were matte black, and on top of that, cheap. From the stand at the end of the checkout counters, he picked up the day's Evening Express. After placing his purchases on the conveyor belt, Jeffrey tapped the scratch card on the stand. "One of these," he said. The cashier took the scratch card Jeffrey pointed to and placed it on the transparent counter above the cash register. Jeffrey paid in cash, avoiding eye contact. He shoved the items into a bag along with the receipt and walked briskly to his car. The purchases were tossed into the passenger's footwell. Reynolds started the car and glanced in the rearview mirror just in time to see a police car speeding past. His heart skipped a beat, and he had to remind himself that he hadn't done anything illegal yet. At least nothing the police would be interested in. Next, Reynolds drove to the library. The library parking lot might be under surveillance, so Jeffrey decided to park in the adjacent building's parking lot. He reached into the footwell and took out his purchases. He ripped the price tags off the clothes and stuffed the trash into his jacket pocket. The scratch card that fell out of the bag ended up at the bottom of his pocket with the garbage. Jeffrey adjusted his blue cap to fit properly and put on the sunglasses. Thankfully, it was a sunny day. Inside the library, however, sunglasses would look at least a bit odd. He considered other options. Some blind people wore sunglasses indoors, he thought. Maybe he should get one of those white canes, Reynolds mused. But what would a blind man do in a library? Or were there books for the blind? No more delaying. This is it, Jeffrey decided and got out of the car. He put on his coat and turned up the collar. Jeffrey looked at his reflection in the side window of the Sierra. The proportions were distorted, but the collar and cap covered his face well. Reynolds set off towards the library. He encountered a group of teenagers with backpacks. The boys circled around Reynolds, but he heard derogatory comments from behind. Exhibitionist, pedophile. Jeffrey was taken aback by the shouting. An exhibitionist? On the contrary. I'm trying to avoid exposing myself, Reynolds thought. The pale-colored library loomed ahead. Large oak trees in front of it must have been much older than the building itself. The building was almost new, Jeffrey thought. In reality, the library had been built 10 years ago, but it still felt new to Reynolds. Time must be passing faster nowadays, Jeffrey pondered as he stopped at the main door. He measured with his eyes the sanctuary of knowledge and stories before him. The 8-feet-high glass door opened automatically, swallowing the tireless readers inside. Reynolds took a deep breath and crossed the threshold. After a short corridor, the space opened up with 2 floors. The left wall was splattered with red paint in vague patterns. Bicycle parts and other random scrap metal were attached among the patterns. Some would call it modern art, but to Reynolds it was pretentious crap, assembled by some sweater-wearing, wine-sipping bohemian drunk to secure his next artist grant. Jeffrey moved closer to the artwork and examined it more closely. In the lower right corner, the title of the piece and the artist's name were displayed. The piece was called The Last Encounter, and the artist was Michael Shore. The name sounded familiar. No way. Foreskin Mike. He had been in the same class in middle school and had already then shown a penchant for pretentious crap. Mike had earned his nickname when he had run screaming out of the bathroom, having trapped his foreskin in his pants zipper. The nickname, Foreskin Mike, had stuck, and it was rumored that even the woodworking teacher had used the name by accident. Now he needed to find the computer. Reynolds scanned the surroundings from behind the protection of his cap and collar, but avoided looking up to keep his face hidden from surveillance cameras that might be 7 feet, at most 10, above. Near the service desk was a pole resembling a road sign. It had arrows pointing in many directions. Children's section, adult section, music section, reading room, restrooms. No mention of computers, but the adult section sounded somehow perverse. Reynolds didn't want to ask the staff about computers as someone might remember him later, and he didn't want to take that risk. He started reading the signs again and stopped at the reading room. There was plenty to read online, Jeffrey thought, so he headed towards the reading room sign. As Reynolds navigated towards the reading room, a cart filled with books unexpectedly shoved in front of him from around a corner. The movable bookshelf slammed directly into Jeffrey's left knee. He staggered forward and had to brace himself against the suddenly appearing shelf. A few books fell to the floor. Reynolds yelped in pain, and a short scream escaped the startled librarian. The woman's face began to flush, and she started apologizing for the collision. Jeffrey just wanted to get out of the situation quickly and grab the cart from the other end to move it out of the way. "It's okay," Reynolds muttered and continued limping towards the reading room. In the reading room, it smelled of newspapers and old people. Reynolds didn't notice that, though. Over 30 years of smoking had dulled his sense of smell. In the nearly 1,000 square feet room, there were about 10 people, mostly older folks. No one paid any attention to Jeffrey entering through the doorway. The silence was only broken by the occasional rustling of newspaper pages. The front wall had large windows. Sunlight filtering through the blinds streaked the linoleum floor. On the left side of the room were light-colored cabinets with 10 doors facing each other. The doors had transparent plastic covers showing various magazines or newspapers, indicating what was behind each door. Some of the covers were empty, as the latest issue had been taken for reading. Random seating was arranged in the room, some around tables. From the right side of the room, Jeffrey found what he was looking for. Along the wall was a table extending the length of the wall. On it were 8 computers, 2 of which had a note saying "out of order," but only one computer was in use. Someone was tapping away at an online card game. Reynolds chose the computer nearest the corner and moved to it. He sat down and pulled the chair closer to the table. The chair legs squeaked loudly against the floor. Reynolds cursed through gritted teeth, but dared not turn to see if the noise had attracted any attention. Jeffrey pressed the spacebar, and the screen came to life after a few seconds of delay. A single click of the left mouse button revealed the Windows desktop. Reynolds found the blue icon resembling an e-book and opened the browser. The homepage read, "Bing by Microsoft." "What the hell is this?" Jeffrey wondered. He was used to Google's search page opening first. He clicked the address bar and typed Google using his index fingers. This time, pressing Enter brought up Google's familiar logo and search field below it. Jeffrey typed "firearms permit" into the search field. In his grammar, the compound word was divided into 3 parts. The search results appeared on the screen in a fraction of a second. He reviewed the options and ended up on the police website reading about firearms permit and license requirements. It turned out that obtaining a permit could take up to a month and a half. He couldn't wait that long. The girl's birthday party was in a couple of weeks. He needed a weapon immediately. Reynolds returned to Google. This time, his search terms were illegal weapons. The first link led to the Evening Express website. Jeffrey clicked it open. The article discussed illegal weapons found during a drug raid. It was no surprise that drugs and guns were related, but Reynolds wasn't thrilled about the idea of dealing with drug users. However, it seemed like the only option. "Damn," Jeffrey cursed, removed his blue cap, and scratched his itchy scalp. Realizing what he had done, he quickly put the cap back on. He looked for the gear icon on the screen and clicked on the browser settings, found the history menu, and deleted the browsing data. That was something he had learned from Steve. Steve Hill had driven one of the company's other trucks just last summer. Back then, there was still enough work. Then, giant transport companies had taken all the good deals. Steve had managed to show him how to handle computers before he had to leave. An accountant had visited and used Reynolds' work laptop to review income and expenses. In the middle of this, a pop-up window had appeared with an explicit image, and Reynolds had turned red, unable to speak. At least he had managed to lower the laptop's screen, and the explicit content had disappeared. The conservative old auditor's visit had been brief, and the collaboration ended there. Later, Steve had shown how to clear the browser history and block unwanted pop-ups. Reynolds had to give up his laptop around the same time as Steve and the other truck. Layoffs in a 2-man company. Reduction needed 1+ porn. After the dismissal, Steve moved to Rovaniemi after getting fired. Meanwhile, porn had moved from the computer screen to the phone's display. Reynolds got up and pulled his cap lower to shield his face. Finally, he dared to look around. None of the people in the room had paid any attention to him. Everyone was engrossed in their newspapers and magazines. An acne-faced online gamer sitting at another computer glanced at Reynolds, but quickly turned his gaze back to the game. Jeffrey had seen enough and headed toward the exit. Along the way, he thought about his outfit. He should have also gotten some gloves. Now his fingerprints would be on the keyboard and mouse. That was the first mistake, hopefully the last. Reynolds suddenly stopped, his train of thought breaking. He thought he had seen something out of the ordinary. Jeffrey took a step back in the direction he had come from and looked inside through an open doorway on the right. On the wall next to the doorway was a sign that read, "Music Section." Reynolds stepped into the room. It wasn't as large as the reading room. The walls of the room were lined with bookshelves filled with books. Some even had CDs. 8 cabinets with their backs facing each other divided the room into 2 sections, leaving a passageway on each side. The cabinets were similar to those in the reading room. Someone at the far end of the right passage was browsing through a book. The cover of the book seemed to feature an acoustic guitar. The person wore wide-legged light jeans and a floral shirt with a light brown leather vest over it. A homemade-looking fabric bag strap rested on his hip. Based on his attire, he might have been called a hippie, but he was missing the long hair. He had deliberately odd glasses, well-groomed mustache, and a strange haircut. He was probably a hipster instead of a hippie. Jeffrey was repulsed, being eccentric just to be different from others. Reynolds thought all hipsters looked the same, and the pretentiousness was repulsive. Reynolds refocused on the shelf that had caused him to deviate from his path. The shelf was filled with DVD cases. Reynolds still couldn't believe his eyes. Fucking hell. Do libraries now have movies too? He tried to find any sign of pricing or a price list, but there was none visible. Can these really be borrowed for free? Jeffrey wondered. The hipster coughed at the end of the passage, and Jeffrey glared in the direction of the sound. The eccentricity seeker was still engrossed in his book. He probably watches his movies on VHS, Reynolds judged. He began to browse the DVD selection in front of him. Lots of classics, including Apocalypse Now, Deliverance, featuring Burt Reynolds without his trademark mustache and a brilliant banjo and guitar duel, and The Deer Hunter, which contained an overly long wedding scene. Jeffrey moved his finger over the titles, reading the names with his head tilted. Oh hell. His finger stopped at a case with white text on a red background. Reynolds pulled the case from the shelf. Yes, it was the Falling Down movie, the same film he had watched about 12 hours earlier. Well, he had missed almost an hour at the start of the film. Jeffrey stared at the iconic cover of the movie. He needed to borrow this. However, he didn't have a library card and needed to get rid of the disguise. Reynolds hid the movie behind other cases, keeping an eye on the hipster. The movie better still be there when he returned, or he would break the hipster's neck. He might do it anyway. Would that be an unusual enough way for the hipster to end his day? Reynolds wondered as left the music section and hurried toward the exit, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. In the lobby, he looked at the wall-mounted artwork again. From this angle, the piece looked to him like a cyclist had been run over by a car, and the blood spatter had spread around the broken bicycle. The Last Encounter was indeed a fitting name for the piece. Horror is in the eye of the beholder, Reynolds thought. His own cleverness brought a smile to his face. Once outside, he quickened his pace. He began to unfasten his coat before reaching the car, but stopped when a group of boys came towards him. They were the same teens who had yelled insults behind his back. Reynolds moved to the edge of the street. He considered jumping in front of the boys at the last moment and ripping his coat open like a proper flasher. The boys approached loudly, cursing and spitting around. They mostly repeated, "Fuck," and drank their energy drinks. Jeffrey held on to the coat's collar. The boys were almost at his side. At the last moment, Reynolds abandoned the idea of revealing what was under the coat. The joke wasn't worth it, considering the risk of the boys remembering him later. He let them pass and continued unfastening the buttons only afterward. The coat, cap, and sunglasses were left on the front seat of the Sierra. Jeffrey slammed the door shut and headed back toward the library. He made a beeline for the music section. There was no sign of the hipster. Lucky bastard. The movie better still be in place. Jeffrey went to the DVD shelf and began searching for the DVD he had hidden behind other cases. He sighed as he got the falling down movie case in his hand. Reynolds headed towards the lobby with the DVD. There he had seen a counter with a sign hanging above it that read, "Checkout." A slender figure sat behind the counter. At first, Reynolds assumed it was a man, but it could have been a woman as well. The face was androgynous, neither masculine nor feminine. Estimating the age was impossible. The person appeared both young and old. This might have been due to the attire, the pallid skin, or the short gray hair. The posture was poor. Despite this, the skin showed no signs of aging, and the hair might have been dyed. Reynolds tossed the DVD onto the counter. "I'd like to borrow this. I don't have a library card, though." When the librarian didn't respond immediately, Reynolds continued, "So how do we proceed?" The person, be it a man or woman, turned their gaze from the computer screen to Reynolds. "Yes, you just need to fill out this form, and I can issue you a card right away," the librarian explained in a delicate voice. Jeffrey stared for a moment, unsure what to make of this ageless, genderless figure. Finally, he focused on the form that had appeared in front of him and began to fill in his details. He wrote Reynolds O.J. in the name field, with periods separating the initials of his first names. After completing his name and address, he handed the form back to the librarian. The librarian looked at the information and, after reading the name, lifted his eyes to the man standing before him. The librarian seemed to think the customer was joking by writing O.J. after his surname, but Jeffrey's expression remained serious. It seemed as if the librarian wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Jeffrey glanced at the paper and guessed the source of the confusion. "Jeffrey Owen," he said, emphasizing each name. "Why did you write O.J. instead of J.O.?" the librarian asked. "It tastes better," Reynolds replied with a grin. The librarian looked at the paper again and then set it down, seemingly satisfied with the explanation. A minute later, Jeffrey left the library for the second time. In his right hand was a well-worn DVD, and in his left, a brand-new library card, Jeffrey's first. The movie and the card ended up on the passenger seat next to his coat and cap. Jeffrey put on his sunglasses. Now he had to think. He sat in the car with both hands on the steering wheel, his index fingers tapping out an uneven rhythm. A legal firearm was out of the question, but where the hell could he get a weapon? The tabloid article had mentioned the connection between illegal weapons and drug gangs. Jeffrey had heard that drugs were sold even in middle schools these days, but he wasn't about to try his luck there. The cops would be on him in no time. Maybe he should start by checking out a nightclub or a biker gang. Suddenly, Jeffrey remembered that on the same industrial estate where his company's small office was located, there was also a biker hangout. He recalled seeing a sign, MC Roadkill HQ, attached to a fence surrounding the building. But he couldn't just walk in and start asking for a gun. And how much would it cost anyway? He had no idea about the prices of weapons, legal or illegal. He regretted not looking into it at the library. He could go back to find out, but it wouldn't change how much money he had available for buying a weapon. Maybe he should figure out his financial situation first. Reynolds started his noisy Sierra and headed towards the nearest ATM, just 4 blocks away. These two were becoming a rare sight, Jeffrey thought. He left the car running by the curb and walked to the ATM. His account balance did not spark any joy. The machine spat out a wad of bills, precisely 320 euros. Not much, but it would have to do. The cash joined the 25 euros already in his wallet. He also had a jar half full of coins at home, meant for a rainy day, or in this case, a tough day. Besides the gun, there were other essentials to buy, so less than 400 euros would be available for the weapon. Maybe he should rob a bank, Jeffrey thought, and chuckled as he got back into the driver's seat. How could he rob a bank without a gun? Jeffrey decided to head to the biker hangout next, to get a sense of the situation. Upon arrival, Jeffrey parked the Sierra across from the biker hangout and rolled down the window. The gates were closed, secured with a thick chain and padlock, The windows of the red brick building were painted black. No one was in sight, and no sounds came from the building. A small breeze made the sign attached to the chain-link fence rattle against the metal. Another sign declared the yard a private area. A third sign on the building wall indicated surveillance. Jeffrey tried to spot the cameras but saw none. There were no motorcycles in the yard today, just a few white 55-gallon barrels and some scattered piles of pallets. Tomorrow, Friday, the bikers would gather for their weekly get-together. Jeffrey had often witnessed this event while driving home from work at the end of the week. Jeffrey had seen enough. He started his car and headed home. In the city center, an elderly woman shuffled towards the police station with a wheeled bag in tow. At the service desk, she immediately demanded to speak with the police chief. When the receptionist behind the glass asked what the matter was, the old woman refused to answer, insisting on speaking only with the chief. The receptionist tried to explain that the police chief was a busy man and would not take a meeting, especially without knowing what it was about. After a few minutes, the receptionist gave up. Getting anything out of the old woman seemed impossible, and it was clear she wouldn't be reasoned with. She directed the difficult senior citizen to a younger constable who was buried in paperwork. The man looked up from his papers to see a cranky-looking senior citizen standing before him, with the receptionist standing behind her. He read the receptionist's lips as she mouthed a silent apology. He nodded to her, and she left. Satisfied to be rid of the troublesome customer, the constable rose from his cluttered desk. He was probably over 6 feet 5 inches tall. The man extended his hand to the old woman for a handshake. She ignored the gesture, huffed, and sat down on the unpadded chair in front of the desk, pulling her wheeled bag closer. The tall officer raised his hand to ruffle his curly brown hair. Dandruff sprinkled onto his uniform, which had Hasselhoff written on the left chest. He sat back down and stared at the old woman for a moment before starting. "So what seems to be the problem? You know, the fire department handles animals stuck in trees." The woman ignored the question. "You need to catch that man, and that car needs to be sent to the junkyard." "Oh, and which man and what car would that be?" Hasselhoff asked with a half-smile. "I don't know names, but he has a white sports car," the old woman replied in a nagging voice. "I see," Hasselhoff said, pulling a grid-lined notebook in front of him. "And was the man white too?" The woman huffed. "Are you going to take care of it?" Hasselhoff drew a car and a stick figure on the paper. Beneath them, he wrote "white," circled the word, and drew arrows pointing to the car and the stick figure. He turned his bright blue eyes back to the old woman and leaned back in his chair. "What exactly are we charging this man and car with? Got any ideas, or should I make something up?" "Noise," the woman barked. "That car makes a horrible racket." Hasselhoff reached over to the notebook and wrote "vroom" next to the car. "All right, thanks for being vigilant and all that. Now off you go. I have real work to do." The woman huffed again. She stood up and grabbed a pen from the desk. She turned the notebook towards herself and drew a spoiler on the car. "It has one of these." Hasselhoff took the notebook and looked at the drawing. "A spoiler, huh? Well, that narrows it down. We'll see what we can do." The old woman left without a word, shuffling away with her wheeled bag. Hasselhoff tossed the grid notebook onto his partner's desk. Anderson paused his grooming of his wheat-brown, 80s-style mullet. "What's this?" Anderson asked, picking up the notebook. "Well, it's clearly a white, noisy sports car. Apparently, the driver needs to be put behind bars and the car sent to the junkyard." Anderson wasn't sure if Hasselhoff was joking. He looked at his partner skeptically, and then back at the scribbled drawing. "Nice drawing," Anderson said sarcastically. Hasselhoff winked and stood up. "Let's go check it out. My butt's getting numb." Hasselhoff headed towards the door leading to the parking garage. Anderson shrugged, grabbed his half-empty energy drink from his desk, and hurried after Hasselhoff. At 9 in the evening, Jeffrey was busy in his kitchenette. He was in a good mood. For the first time in a while, there was some excitement in his life and something to look forward to. The only thing spoiling the mood was the argument coming from the next-door apartment. A door slammed so hard the glasses in the cupboard rattled. He really needed to print those divorce papers. The shouting continued next door, followed by a crash and a loud thud, then silence. Jeffrey adjusted his hearing aid a couple of notches louder and listened. It was completely silent. The silence sounded more worrying than the previous shouting match. Did one of them just kick the bucket? Jeffrey took a drinking glass from the cupboard, placed it against the wall, and pressed his ear to the bottom of the glass. The glass amplified the sounds coming from the other side of the wall. At first there was nothing, but slowly a rhythmic creaking began to emanate from the other side, as the wooden parts of the bed rubbed against each other. Now they were already making up. Reynolds adjusted his hearing aid again, this time a couple of notches lower. He should include a pack of condoms with the divorce papers. Those two definitely shouldn't be making any kids. The main thing, however, was that they wouldn't ruin his movie enjoyment now that they had quieted down. Jeff continued spreading liver pâté on his crisp bread. There was nothing else to put on the bread. Another piece of bread was already waiting on a plate on the kitchen counter. Jeff grabbed the bread and placed it on the table next to the armchair. He took the DVD case from the coffee table and crouched in front of the TV stand. The disc wouldn't come out of the case. It bent alarmingly before it finally popped out of the center. Reynolds placed the disc in the player, and after a moment of fiddling with the remote, he got the right channel on the TV. He was just about to sit down when he realized he had forgotten something. Jeff dashed to the fridge for a six-pack of Budweiser. They were the last ones left, pilfered from the work supply. Reynolds got comfortable in the armchair, opened a beer, and took a bite of his crisp bread. The movie started, and Jeff was completely absorbed in it once again. A few hours later, Reynolds woke up needing to pee. He had fallen asleep before the movie ended, catching up on the part he missed the night before. Groggy, Reynolds got up and almost stumbled over a half-drunk six-pack. Its plastic ring had caught around his toe, and Jeffrey had to shake his foot free. Walking towards the bathroom, he tried to figure out what time he would need to wake up in the morning. His brain was blank. As he relieved himself, he concluded that he wouldn't need to get up until after 7. His first pickup was at 8. Jeffrey turned off the TV and headed to the bedroom. He set the alarm on his clock radio for 7 and collapsed face first onto the bed. He was extremely tired, but sleep was hard to come by. Thoughts of buying an illegal gun and encountering a biker gang kept swirling in his mind. It was necessary for the next phase of the job. Eventually, Reynolds drifted into a restless sleep.